Chapter 10 of Miller's text focuses on a number of problematic aspects of relationships that can undermine trust and closeness with others. The chapter is entitled Stresses and Strains. Certainly the topics discussed in Chapter 10 do stress relationships. There is, however, a more general literature on stress and coping. Classically, the literature on stress and coping primarily focused on the way individuals experienced various forms of stress in their lives and coped with them. Dating back to the mid-20th century, however, there has been some interest in how families and couples in particular experience and deal with stress. The purpose of this video is to provide a selective glimpse into stress and coping as understood and studied within relationship science. In doing so, I have put together a montage of elements gathered from multiple sources. This narrated PowerPoint loosely follows a historical timeline. It starts in the mid-20th century with Reuben Hill's ABCX model of family stress. It then moves to stress, spillover, and crossover, which was an interest starting in the 1980s, moves to the vulnerability stress adaptation model from the 1990s, and finally ends with Voderman's dyadic coping model of the 21st century. Reuben Hill was among the most distinguished family scholars of the mid-20th century. Born in 1912, he entered college at the beginning of the Depression and earned his PhD just before the beginning of World War II. Both these events caused separations and considerable stress for families. These events undoubtedly fostered his interest in family stress. His ABCX model and research on the topic is recognized as a still influential pioneering effort.
Researchers have developed a model that allows us to understand how we react to stress, known as the ABCX model. Using this model, we can break down the different elements of stress and understand how much control we have in the situation. This helps us make more sense of the situation and our response, and gives us a starting point to deal with the stressor. A is the stressor. This could be anything from your son coming home drunk, to your daughter forgetting to take her wallet on a trip, to losing a job, to a dog vomiting on the carpet. B is the resources that help you respond to the stressor, such as a savings account, a sense of humor, or strong relationships with your spouse or kids. C stands for our perceptions of the event, such as viewing the situation as an absolute tragedy, a minor stressor, or a helpful learning experience. The X is the amount of stress we feel, or whether or not it becomes a crisis. Let's say your high schooler, who's typically a good student, brings home a failing grade. This is your stressor, your A piece of the model. How would your child perceive this failing grade? How would they expect you to react? Do they think you think their failing grade is world-ending? They're already in trouble for breaking curfew last weekend, and they're worried this test grade will push you as a parent over the edge. They're also seriously concerned what this means for the future of their education. This response is the C in our model. Your child may feel they have limited resources. They don't get along great with their teacher. They feel embarrassed and uncomfortable seeking out tutoring. They've been fighting with you a lot lately, which has strained your relationship. They know you can't afford to pay for their college, which means that college will only likely happen with a scholarship. This is the B in our model. We can see here how resources and perceptions influence one another quite a bit. If your teenager got along with the teacher, they would perceive their teacher as a resource and seek out tutoring. But because they aren't likely to get help, they'll continue to see this failing grade as an obstacle. They perceive you as an antagonist as well, which means they're expecting you to react negatively. Limited financial resources also make this failing grade seem potentially world-ending. If this situation plays out as previously described, it's likely to trigger a potential crisis in your teenager's life, or at least a very high level of stress that can affect other aspects of their life. This is the X. The goal with appropriately responding to stress is to have the X, the resulting level of stress, to be as low as possible so we can learn from this event and continue on with life.
Hill's first model is called the roller coaster profile of adjustment, or the roller coaster model. And it basically investigated families who had reached a crisis point and then what was the process that they went through after the crisis. And so Hill said that as families adjust to a crisis, they have these stages. First, there's the crisis. Then there's the period of disorganization where they kind of fall apart, right? Because the reason why it's a crisis is the stress has exceeded their ability to kind of cope, right? Exceeded their coping, their resources. And so now they're in a period of disorganization. And then they have this angle of recovery, which gives us a sense of how deeply are they disorganized or severely are they disorganized? How long do they spend in a period of disorganization? And then how long does it take them to recover? So the angle of recovery kind of talks about the severity of the disorganization and also the length of time for recovery. And then families can come out to a new level of organization. And this graph just shows kind of, one level where they come back out to where they started. But we'll see some upcoming pictures that help us realize that they can reorganize at a better level, the same level, or a worse level than from where they started. And so Pauline Boss, who was a professor at the University of Minnesota, she's now retired, is really credited for the theory of ambiguous loss. And this was she built on family stress theory. She basically took the conceptualization of the A, or stressor event, and added in that idea of ambiguity and being unambiguous, like we talked about on the previous slide. Her early examples were studying families where a person was physically absent but psychologically present. So families that had a soldier missing in action, or the really scary and sad situation of families with kidnapped children, where there was this person who wasn't in their lives but as far as they knew was still alive, and that could be in some ways more stressful than just having a loved one die, because it's this gray area, this limbo time where you don't know kind of where they are or what's happened to them. And then she did kind of the opposite in researching families with a loved one with dementia, where you've got this person physically present in front of you, but they're not themselves anymore, and so they're psychologically absent. And so how that's stressful too. You can't decide whether or not you're grieving them or not, because they're there physically, but they're not really themselves. And so this concept of ambiguous loss has gone on to be explained or used in a lot of different ways, but those are some early examples. Okay, so as we think about the key concepts in family stress theory, they are all the things that we've just already talked about with the roller coaster and ABCX models. And so I've just listed them here for clarity so that you've got them when you're perhaps, summarizing family stress.
In the 1980s, researchers started being interested in the relationship between work and the family. A specific topic that began getting attention is what is called stress spillover and stress crossover. This line of research added to the dyadic and couple stress research literature. The next slide explains these concepts, and the following slide after that reports on a recent study of them.
So let's jump right into it. So stress spillover occurs whenever the effects of stress in one domain of a person's life are transmitted to other domains of that person's life. So an example of this would be if stress in your workplace creates stress in your relationship. So this occurs entirely within an individual. Just like how stress spillover can be like an external concept spilling over into your relationship problems can actually also spill over into domains outside the relationship. So, for example, a messy divorce could cause lower performance in the workplace. So, conversely, stress crossover occurs whenever stress experienced by one partner in a relationship affects the outcomes and functioning of the other partner. So, unlike stress spillover, this actually occurs between individuals rather than within an individual. So, for example, when husbands report more work stress, their wives actually report more symptoms of emotional problems and worsened symptoms like depressive symptoms. And that was found by Rook, Dooley, and Catalano in 1991.
And so we wanted to look at that. This is already a blossoming realm of research, is looking at stress spillover and stress crossover, and we wanted to look at that in same-sex couples where there's much less attention, and look at whether we see the same pattern with sexual minority stress that's experienced on a daily basis. So that's essentially what we wanted to do here and what we did.
So what's the general patterns in this area of research overall?
Generally find that the more stressed we are by these outside, what we call outside stressors, these external stressors, the stressors that are not necessarily about my relationship or my interactions with my partner. So we find that the more of these external stressors I have, the more stressed out I am, the more stress I'm going to experience in my relationship. And there's lots of explanations for why that spillover process happens. But we also see that my stress impacts my partner's perception of stress in the relationship. And so in the paper, we find that, yes, that pattern that continues, that spillover and that crossover pattern of general external stress, but we see that pattern happen with minority stress as well, sexual minority stress. So discrimination associated with being a sexual minority member. We see the similar pattern of stress spillover and stress crossover.
One of the things in your title says moderating effects of emotion regulation or in emotion regulation. Can you kind of go into that?
Yes, absolutely. So when we think of emotion regulation, we typically would expect that emotion regulation is a tool, is a strategy, something we have on our in our toolbox that we can use to cope with stress. And so, like many before us, we're interested in looking at emotion regulation in this context when looking at this daily stressors. And so we expect that someone with greater difficulty regulating their emotions, we may see a stronger spillover or crossover effect, right? Because theoretically, someone who struggles to regulate their emotions, when they're stressed, they're more likely to externalize and behave in a different manner. And so there may be the greater likelihood that if I struggle to regulate my emotions and I'm having a stressful day, I'm going to inevitably impact my relationship, my partner, and both mine and their perceptions of the relationship. So that's really what we're looking at here is not only, do we see this similar spillover crossover effect with sexual minority stress, but is emotion regulation and difficulties in emotion regulation playing a role in the degree or intensity of this spillover crossover process. And we found that it did. Again, the findings are nuanced because there's a whole lot, like everything but the kitchen sink is in the analysis, and so that can create certain challenges. But it is a pattern that we see here is that emotion regulation skills are important for spillover and crossover for me and my partner. So both of our skills are important in this relationship. But when you zoom out, these daily experiences and that spillover and crossover that happens on a daily basis that doesn't get the same level of attention as big crises, it adds up over time. And over time, it impacts the longevity of relationships as well as physical health.
Ben Carney and Thomas Bradbury of UCLA formulated the Vulnerability Stress Adaptation VSA model as a framework for conceptualizing the dynamic processes of marriage. The VSA model is an integration of several perspectives: social exchange theory, attachment, crisis theory, and the dialysis stress model. Created to account for variations in marital quality and stability over time, it considers three key factors. A, couple members' enduring vulnerabilities, B, their experience of stressful events, and C, other adaptive processes. The VSA model posits that couples who have few enduring vulnerabilities, encounter few stressors, and employ effective adaptive processes are likely to experience high marital quality and stability. The model was originally articulated as a framework for organizing the literature on marital satisfaction, but subsequently has been used as a framework for conducting research and informing practice. Lazarus and Folkman were among the premier researchers on the ways individuals cope. They were noted for their distinction between emotion-focused and problem-focused coping. Important in itself, this distinction served as a foundational element in later analyses of dyadic coping. In the 21st century, researchers began realizing that coping is not only an individual process, but something partners do together. Various approaches emerged under the rubric of dyadic coping. Guy Bodeman is a leading proponent of this stream of work. He developed what is called the Systemic Transactional Model, STM, drawing in part on Lazarus and Folkman's emotion and problem-focused approach. Bodeman considers how not only individuals but also couples together can appraise and cope with stressful situations. In terms of coping, Bodeman sees both positive and negative coping strategies. Supportive dyadic coping occurs when one partner provides problem and/or emotion-focused support that assists the other partner in coping. Joint or common dyadic coping occurs when both partners systematically work together to create problem and/or emotion-focused support that assists the couple in coping. Delegated dyadic coping occurs when one partner takes over responsibilities to reduce their partner's stress. Negative dyadic coping includes hostile, ambivalent, and superficial actions or words of a deleterious nature. The next two slides give examples of these different types of coping. Positive forms of coping are associated with better marital outcomes. I will give you some time to read this sample of positive coping actions. Bodeman's negative coping actions vary along a dimension of intensity, starting with hostile. My partner blames me for not coping well enough. Ambivalent. My partner provides support but is unmotivated. And superficial. When I'm distressed, my partner tends to withdraw. In summing up, Reuben Hill was a pioneer in studying stress and coping in families. In his ABCX and roller coaster models, he envisioned a pattern which involved initial disorganization, followed by recovery and reorganization. Other than families talking about closing ranks, he did not elaborate much, however, on the precise ways families cope. In the 1980s, spillover versus crossover stress were recognized, drawing attention to how one person's stress can create stress for their partner. In the 1990s, Carney and Bradbury in their VSA model underscored the importance of underlying vulnerabilities in susceptibility to stress and largely applied their model to how stress and coping affects marital satisfaction and stability. In the 21st century, Bodeman and others have explored how partners experience and cope together with stress. Bodeman differentiated types of couples coping, both positive and negative. Overall, it is fair to say that stress can have negative effects on individuals and couples, but that it is not always the case that stress has detrimental effects, depending in part on how effectively we cope with the stressors we face. Hopefully, you will cope effectively with the stressors in your life. All best wishes.